Okay. Um, all right. Let's start off here. Okay. Right. We are ready to start then. And well, welcome everyone to this featured book session. I am Steve Lloyd Moffat. I am a professor of comparative religion. Most of my work in community early on was done on monks in the early Christian and early Hindu tradition. And more recently, I've been working on contemporary communities. We are excited for this session. This is a book that I'm a big fan of, and we are excited to get to talk about it in more depth. Our book is it right here? The book is Better to Have Gone: Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Oroville. Our author is Akash Kapur. He is an Indian American journalist and author who grew up in Oroville in India until the age of 16, when his studies took him to boarding school in the United States. Eventually, he graduated from Harvard, received a Rhodes Fellowship to study in Oxford. As a journalist, his writings have appeared in The Atlantic, The Economist, the New York Times, The New Yorker, Time Magazine, many other publications. He is the former Letter from India columnist for the International New York Times. His first book in 2012 was India Becoming, the story of India amidst change. And the book we invited him to discuss today is Better to Have Gone: Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia, which came out in 2021. Better to Have Gone was an Amazon bestseller, named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, New Statesman, and other lists. It's also for my partner and I, Amy Hart, who is another community scholar with in the history area, one of our favorite books. We read it cover to cover, out loud to each other over several months, and it led to many great discussions, which I think is a sign of a fantastic book. We could give much more introduction to it, but I just want to read one sentence from a review from the New York Times Book Review, in which Amy Waldman wrote, "This is a haunting, heartbreaking story, deeply researched and lucidly told, with an almost painful emotional honesty. The use of the present tense weaving a kind of trance. I kept wanting to read Better to Have Gone because I found it so gripping. I kept wanting not to read it because I found it so upsetting. The image that came to mind again and again was of human lives being dashed against the rocks of rigid belief." So we are in for a treat today for the discussion. How this will work, I will have a conversation with Akash for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for discussion. So thank you, Akash, for being here and being willing to share your experiences and your book.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
For those who haven't read it, and I really encourage you to do, there's at least 3 stories that seem interwoven throughout the book. There is the history of Oroville, this extraordinary community that's been around for nearly 55 years, and its evolutions and drama. There's a mystery around the surprising death of the mother and stepfather of Akash's wife. Her mother is Diane and Father John, who were prominent pioneers in the founding of Oroville, that died tragically and somewhat mysteriously. And then there's Akash's relationship to Oroville, growing up as a child and returning as an adult. And at one level, it's a very personal memoir about your relationship to this community that you and your wife grew up in. And so I guess we'll just start off as, what are the origins of this project? Did one of these stories start off and then the other get woven in, or how did those come about?
Yeah, and thanks for identifying those strands. It was definitely, a key feature or bug of the book, depending on how you look at it. It was definitely, it definitely made the writing of the book challenging because we were balancing out all these different strands. The origins of this really are I mean, so you identified this strand that is my wife's parents and their mysterious deaths in Orville, and the book really starts off. That's kind of the kernel of the book, and that's what provides a narrative arc to the book. And it's a long story, but essentially, when her parents die, my wife is adopted by her father's sister, and so years later in New York, I'm sitting in her apartment and I open a drawer and there's this green folder and I pull it out and it's all these letters that her brother had written to her from Oroville. And her brother came, they came from a very interesting family. They were sort of East Coast, I don't want to say nobility because you don't have nobility in America, but East Coast Brahmins, East Coast upper class, very cultured, a lot of money, establishment figures, in Georgetown, in Washington, and her father was, basically one of the founders of the National Art Gallery, first director, first curator. And so their son abandoned all of this and moved to Orville to be one of the founders. And so that all that is contained in this correspondence. And it's the amazing sort of story of this person that abandons everything, moves to Orville, helps found this community, and then slowly actually ends up dying in Orville. And the correspondence was incredibly vivid and moving. And that was the kernel of the book. I wanted to write the story of this man, and I wanted to write the story of his dreams and how they sort of went sour in a way. And then the book just grew from there because I quickly realized, well, you can't tell the story of these people of Orville without telling the story of Orville. And I can't tell the story of Orville without talking about my relationship to Orville over time. I wasn't born there, but I moved there when I was, 2 years old and then spent most of my life there. And I think each step, each sort of moving away from the kernel, I hesitated because I was like, I want to write the story of John Walker. That feels like safe territory. He died in 1986. It was a long time ago. Oh no, like I don't want to write a history of Orville. That's way too fraught. And it's way too complex. Oh no, I definitely don't want to write about my relationship to Orville because that's just way too personal. So there's all these stages in the evolution of the book.
Yeah. I mean, so we can go on either of those threads, but let's start off with your own family, because I mean, your family is an interesting story of getting to Oroville too. For those who haven't read, it's your dad being a Hindu from Pakistan pre-partition, your mom being from small farming town, I think in Minnesota, if I remember, or
Yep.
something like that. How did they end up in Oroville and part of this group?
Yeah. I think, I mean, yes, it's an unusual story and it's interesting. I think probably most people who ended up in Oroville had sort of interesting stories, right? Like, how does anybody end up in a place like this? But I don't know how much any of you really know about Oroville, but essentially, Oroville is an offshoot of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, which is located in Pondicherry, and which is a more traditional Indian ashram that had come up originally around Sri Aurobindo, and then his spiritual partner, Mira Alfasa, known as the Mother. And so my father's side of the family ended up there. His father, yes, they were refugees from Pakistan during partition. I think that in many ways they were broken by it. I think there was, it was a very traumatic experience. And I think that probably his father, so my grandfather, in some ways was a searcher and ended up in the ashram. And so Oroville is an extension of that. And that's partly why my family ended up there. The story of my mother, who, as you say, grew up in a small farming town on the border between South Dakota and Minnesota, from today's vantage point, how does she end up in Orville? That seems very unusual. From the vantage point of the 1960s, like it was less unusual, right? And I mean, it's almost like out of a movie. My father was he was studying in America, and where does he meet my mom? He meets her at an anti-war rally, right? Like an anti-Vietnam War rally, and they get together and they're dreamers, and it's the 60s, and they believe they're going to reinvent the world, and they kind of like travel overland to India, which again sounds so exotic now, but it wasn't that exotic, right? In the 60s and the early 70s. And then they end up in Orville, and they're living in this thatch hut at the edge of like, a sort of barren land, because that's what Orville was back then. And then they're part of this kind of like brave experiment to build this new world.
And that's where they encounter John and Diane. So
Yeah.
were your two parents friends in Orville in those early ages?
Yeah, well, you know how these small communities are. Everybody knows everybody, right? So yes, they were friends. I don't have I was a baby, but like I know that I encountered John and Diane as a child, and so yeah, everybody knew everybody. Yes.
I think one of the as you say, one of the threads is this mystery around John Diane, and I know as at least as we read it, you're kind of watching it with, oh gosh, one page after the next, you're just like, oh, I can see where this is going, and it's almost uncomfortable to
Mhm.
read as you go through. But I thought it was fascinating that you pointed out that even in the years leading up to John's death, he was actually happy there,
Mhm.
and was surprisingly positive. I just wonder if you can talk about sort of his evolution of being there and what led John to be there, because he's such a central figure to this whole story.
Yeah. Well, I'll come to that happiness note in a minute, but just to sort of sum
Yeah.
up, his story is he's another child of the 60s, and he's growing up again, establishment Republican father. John volunteered on Bob Kennedy's, Robert Kennedy's campaign. He's actually in the hotel in LA when Robert Kennedy's assassinated. Just to kind of give a sense, somebody called John like a Forrest Gump like figure because he's everywhere as things are happening. He was served in the army. He narrowly missed being implicated in My Lai, like he was in the division that actually committed the My Lai massacre, but he was never shipped off to Vietnam. So he's very much a child of the 60s. He's got a very strong spiritual bent, and he had spent time in a Catholic monastery, which I spent time at while researching this book. He was always a searcher, always sort of looking. And he ends up like many children of the 60s traveling to India. He ends up in Oroville. He ends up kind of surrendering, and what I mean, not just surrendering his privilege, but surrendering his sort of like rational mind, if you will, and deciding to cast his lot with faith, which I think was always very hard for his family to understand. And then he ends up being part of the building of Oroville. um, he's an unusual character because he comes from so much privilege, and in the early years, like his family's wealth, frankly, is actually supporting a lot of Oroville and a lot of Orvillians. um the thing that happens with John, on this note of happiness, is he remains a searcher. And so this is my reading of his letters and his diaries, and it's somewhat contested by my wife and by other people who knew John, but I see him as spending the first, I don't know, 10 years in Orville searching, never quite landing, somewhat burdened by his wealth and privilege, thinking about moving back to America, doing a PhD in religious studies, not knowing what to do. And then he ends up in a situation which I won't give away because it's like a sort of plot thing, but it's by all accounts like a tragic situation with his partner Diane, who's my wife's mother. But in this situation, they find the gift of faith, and John finds the gift of faith, which I think he had just spent his whole life searching for. And so the way I read it, the way I read his letters, I see more settledness and contentedness and just sort of self-assuredness in these last few years of his life, even as we know that it's hurtling towards disaster, right? And so this is, in a way, it's at the sort of like center of the book, like it's the sort of core question of the book. Better to have gone question mark. There are different takes on this. My wife, obviously, who's looking at this as the loss of two parents, doesn't see it that way. She sees it as death, and needless death, because they were, it was preventable death. His sister, whom I engaged with a lot and got to know quite well, it was interesting because when I started off researching the book, she certainly saw it as utterly senseless, horrible, feckless death that the community, didn't necessarily cause, but stood by and sort of let happen. And by the end of the book, she's seeing more purpose in it, and she's seeing more meaning in it, and she's sort of seeing that her brother had the gift of faith.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that comes out through the book, the sort of struggle between a rigid faith, flexible faith, science, reality. And I'm sort of curious if you think that, uh, you know, for uh, um, for those who haven't kept up with Akash's more recent work, he's been teaching a class on utopia at Princeton, and continued to think about this. What's the relationship between these utopian communities and faith, science, and that? How has that evolved in your own mind?
Yeah. I quote Thomas Merton somewhere in the book, who describes faith as a journey, right? And we're all on this journey somewhere between rationality and surrender. And everybody exists somewhere at a different point on that continuum, right? And one of the core questions in the book for me is just like, where on that continuum do you tip over from beauty, nobility of faith into some of the more ugly, fanatical aspects of faith? And the book both as a sociological phenomenon, i.e. the community, and also as an individual phenomenon in John's life, is very much exploring those boundaries. And I guess I'm exploring them at the same time while writing the book in my own life, because I grew up in a community that was based on faith, that was very structured on faith, and many of the people around me always had a lot of faith. And I say somewhere in the book that I probably grew up around a surfeit of faith. And I think for much of my life, I reacted to that faith. And then I ended up in places like Harvard or Oxford, which are at the opposite end of that spectrum in terms of the sort of like rational inquisition of faith. And you would think that in writing a book about a man and a woman who died because of too much faith, I would end up really sort of like looking down on faith, right? But there's something about the interaction with the nobility of faith, with the beauty of John's search, and sort of aspirational quality of it, that was really surprising to me. And every book is a journey, and I was surprised by my own journey, that I end up, I wouldn't say that I have the gift of faith, but I end up much closer to it than I do at the start of the book. I describe it as like, I understand where I see the door open and I sort of see the light on the other side, but I haven't been able to quite like take the journey into there. So that's kind of like my personal journey as an author thinking about faith. I can talk more about the communal aspect if you'd like. I don't want to like go on and on, but there, that was part of your question too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you, as a reader, you go on this journey of both finding the beauty in John and Diane's sort of faith and optimism and idealism, and then the next paragraph going, okay, that's child abuse. That's irresponsibility
Yeah.
in it. And I'm wondering, have you gotten any pushback of kind of idealizing these characters, or people who are involved and look back and been like, okay, no, that's a sort of Pollyanna view of that period, or how has been the response of
Yeah.
people who knew them and such?
Yeah, of course. Look, I think as an author, you tend to know you've done the right thing when you get pushback from both sides. Like if you get pushback from one side, you figure you've written an unbalanced, polemical kind of work. And so what you hope for professionally, if not personally, is for both sides to come at you. And so yeah, like I've received pushback certainly from people who think that I'm idealizing these deaths and idealizing what was a tragic, senseless death or deaths. And I've also received pushback from the other side within the community who not too much, but to a certain extent, who think that I denigrate faith. I never, like, how could you have lived all these years in Orville and not understood what this place is really about, not understand the beauty of the faith, not understand that what John and Diane were doing were following Mother's teachings and really sort of like stepping over to the other side. So yeah, I've received pushback on both sides, and I don't know if I say I'm proud of both, it sounds a little egotistical. So I welcome both is probably a better way to put it. But I think the problem with faith is that it's very categorical, and I grew up in a place that was too categorical, and so if I have faith in one thing, it's like sort of like the desire, the need to step away from categorical thinking, and I don't think there's a clear answer to what John and Diane were doing. And as I said, their journey is paralleled by a social journey, because we see Orville casting about for faith and stepping into some very murky territory that many of these types of communities step into, right? We have book burnings, we have like ostracizations, what I would just describe as fanatical type behavior that echoes a lot of the worst sort of tendencies of these communities throughout history. And so you're exploring that boundary too.
Yeah. In your relationship to Oroville, it's wonderfully complex. You leave at 16 and Oroville is one thing. You return, I think, in your 40s or somewhere around
20s,
there.
late 20s actually.
Late 20s. Okay. But you're a different person and Oroville's a different place. And so I'm wondering if you want to share a bit that journey of how your relationship in moving back with your family was different from perhaps your family growing up's relationship with Oroville.
Yeah. One of the most common questions I got in the sort of aftermath of this book was like, why did you move back? Right? Like why did Orleans move back? You described moving away, you went to like these schools. I don't know, could have got a job as a banker or whatever, right? Like better fate. Anyway, I get these questions. And why did we move back? I don't know. I say somewhere in the book that children of intentional communities are like exiles. And the way I think about that is you grow up, you believe in these places, you have faith in them, and then you grow up and you're like, it's a little more complicated, and you see the kind of seamier side of this stuff, but you still have these dreams in your head that were kind of, impregnated there from a very young age. And so you're exiled from that sort of Edenic vision of a more perfect world. And I think that to some extent it's very hard to like go back to reality, right? You're always kind of chasing that. And so I think that's one of the reasons we moved back. I think that was a subconscious thing. I don't think that was conscious, but I think that's one of the reasons we moved back. And yes, Oroville had changed over time, and it continues to change. When I was a kid there, it was very much virgin territory. It was much smaller. It was this desert. Like, for those who know Oroville, probably it's, one of its most successful, one of its biggest accomplishments has been the green work, the reforestation of the land, the sort of nourishment of the land. And so in a very physical way, you've seen the community come to life, right? And what was once a barren land is now forest. Trees that you knew as saplings are now like sort of giant trees. And so physically, the landscape has changed a lot. It's also become bigger. It's become more complex. A community of 300 or 400 people has grown into 3,000 people, which is both a testament to its success, but also introduces all kinds of new complexities and new problems. And so that's the Oroville we came back to and spent the next, honestly, 15 to 16 years of our life at. I mean, we sort of took a step back during COVID for a whole bunch of personal reasons, but until 3 years ago, we were like living there full time.
And raising children there as well, if I remember correctly, right?
And raising our children there, who went
Yeah.
to the schools there. And this, by the way, the schools are like one of the things that had changed dramatically for the better in Oroville, because I describe in the book, when I was a kid, the schools were like, they were shut down. There was a kind of whole anti-education type movement, as in, we're going to reinvent the whole world, including conventional education. Therefore, let's start by not having education. And by the time my kids went there, the schools are actually great, really, really good schools. And I think, my kids, like, I really am so grateful for the education that they received there.
How did the faith component shift? It sounded like the early pioneers were pretty true believers in Aurobindo's vision and Mother as a guide. In your experience raising your kids there, was there more diversity of belief structures or less rigidity? Or
yeah, and I might have answered this question somewhat differently to you 2 years ago, because again, I don't know how many of you follow what's happening in Oroville, but it's going through a fairly new phase and tumultuous kind of period in its history. And so I guess what happens with these types of communities and faith and idealism, looking at it now, I say that you have these kind of like oscillations, and they go through cycles of, loosening up on the faith stuff, and then tightening up and loosening up. And so, yes, the early pioneers were true believers, and they had the Mother as their kind of northern light to guide them. And then after the Mother passed away, as you all know, because you study this, like often these communities fall apart when the founder is no longer there. And that almost happens to Oroville. It goes kind of wild. There's all kinds of contestations for power. And one of the ways it comes together is essentially with this kind of like, we're going to rekindle the fires of true belief. And it veers over into what I think of as fanaticism, and just kind of becomes pretty wild that way. And then it loosens up, I think, partly in reaction to that. So by the time I moved back there was a kind of like, let's step back from the embers of like this really fanatical true belief. Let's like, try to build a society. It was fairly undogmatic when I was there, and when my kids were growing up. There were certainly corners of dogmatism and sort of true belief, for better or for worse. And I thought that was the journey that Oroville was on. Like, I thought it was in this kind of more accommodationist, wider spectrum sort of approach to faith. But then the last 3 years, I've seen it go back towards like, we've lost our purpose. We need to rekindle there's too much non-core stuff going on here. We need to rekindle the fires of faith, which in my view has a lot of sort of negative consequences. But I really see a kind of oscillation and cyclical sort of approach to faith in this way.
Yeah. One of the interesting subplots of Oroville and your book maybe not colonialism, but this complex relationship between the West and India. Aurobindo clearly is deeply Indian, but mother is French by background, if I remember correctly. And Diane is from Belgium. John is American. Your mom's American. I mean, this complex relationship with East and West. And I wonder, have you seen that? How do you think that shaped the founding of Oroville and the relationship, even in the characters? I say characters, but they're your family members, your parents, and then your wife's parents.
Yeah, it is a very complex relationship, and I noticed that in your organization, like many of the members come from kibbutzim in Israel, and that same sort of complex relationship to a local population and settling the land and who belongs, and these questions come up a lot. And some of the criticism of the book was along those lines, that this is like Orville is a neo-colonial society and that I didn't acknowledge it sufficiently. And I hear that criticism, and I don't see it as that simple. I think there are elements of the community and the way it's shaped up where I think that's a valid criticism for sure. But being myself half white American and half Indian, I sort of like, I guess I have a foot in each camp, and I see it differently, and I see the complexity of it. And I think Orville's relationship to the local villages has been really complex. In many cases, many of the local sort of original local population has joined the community and has become a very sort of like essential part of the community. And in some ways, local life has changed for the better. In some ways, it's been worse. And there's been like this influx of like people who've come in and taken the land. So it's a very complex relationship. I think, again, it's one of these things that it's easy to come at with a preconceived ideological notion. And I would recognize, and I would respect that notion if it were identifying a colonial strain in the community. I would also respect the notion if it would say, no, that's not what it is at all, because I think there's both things going on. It's a very complex thing that, by the way, then has to be situated within the wider context of India as it's changed and developed. Because like when I was a kid growing up in Oroville really felt like this kind of forgotten land that was like cut off from the world. There were like hardly any roads leading from the rest of India to Oroville. And over time, it's become, the real estate has become much more valuable. There's roads leading there. And so you have like urban India crowding in and settling it. And there've been questions about like, well, what is this community with like 3,000 people, 50% of whom are white, that are like sitting on this land, and we want to build our country homes here instead. And so that way it's also become very complex in recent times.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting aspects that I think you mentioned in the book, but it might have been an interview I listened to, just about what the percentage of Indians that are part of Oroville, and how that has shifted over time. That not just the relationship with the external communities, but it has become over time more Indians in leadership.
Yeah, I think I think about these numbers may have changed in the last couple of years, but I think it's about half the community is now Indian. And I'm certain one way of looking at that is like, what type of community in India would have 50% white? And this feels neo-colonial. If in that case, then you would just ask, what does an international community mean, right? The whole point of an international community is to have diverse people from around the world. But yeah, like about half the community is Indian. Also, within the Indian population, there's a huge amount of diversity, because you have local, like what was essentially a fairly impoverished local agrarian population, Tamil population, and then you have people who've come in from the north, and who are more upper class, middle class, well educated. So there's a lot of difference within that population. It's by no means homogenous. I guess like one way I would look at this is, what is, leaving aside the sort of demographic composition of Oroville, what is Oroville's interaction with and contribution to India at large? And as probably, again, many of you know, like one of the problems with these communities is they tend to be fairly inward looking and isolated in many ways. I think that's the nature of a lot of these communities, right? And there may be good reasons for that. But I think for a lot of Oroville's history, that's been true. And that's become kind of increasingly untenable over time. And so the things that I would identify as positive contributions to this kind of strain of thought are cases where Orville, let's say, is taking some of the work it's done, like it's done really pioneering work in solar energy or green work, and is taking that out into India and interacting with India and contributing knowledge and learning from India. And those types of experiments, which have been happening increasingly frequently, are like quite heartening from this point of view.
Mhm. Yeah. For those who are joining us, we are talking with Akash Kapur, the author of Better to Have Gone, and we're going to open up questions in about 10 minutes. I want to shift a little bit just to the writing of the book, because you're both a character in the book and an objective journalist telling sometimes difficult stories about people who, in the end, you're related to. So how did you negotiate those dual roles? Did it create a challenge for you as you were telling these stories?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I've been kind of writing and being a journalist or a reporter long enough that you start feeling like half your soul is sort of like has become that. And so I've gotten pretty good at sort of switching into professional mode, which, any nonfiction writer or journalist will tell you that there's a kind of exploitative aspect to that, where you're like trying to get stories out of people. That gets complicated when like the stories you're getting concern the deaths of your wife's parents, right?
Mhm.
And navigating that, there were certainly some kind of complicated moments. One example that I sometimes give is I'm trying to think how to tell the story without giving away key plot elements. But my wife's mother dies, and as she's dying, there are not many people around, and there's some mystery to how she dies on the day she dies. And then I found a woman, an Italian woman, who was actually in the room with her and spoke to her during that process, and she gave me some pretty intense, gruesome details about it, including things that she said about her daughter, i.e., my wife. And I'm in like journalist mode here and all excited to get these stories and scribbling furiously. I'm like, oh my God, great plot elements. And I get out of the room and I get on my phone and I call my wife, right? And I'm like, oh, guess what I just found out? It's amazing. Guess what she saw? Guess what she told me? Halfway through that sentence, you stop and there's a kind of silence at the other end. And yeah, you're talking about the day her mother died, right? And the day that she was effectively left orphaned. And this is difficult territory to navigate. Before I really embarked on the book, my wife and I had a series of conversations, right? We're like, are we going to do this? Are we actually going to do this? And we thought through it. And you recognize that like once you sort of cross the barrier and you decide you're going to do it, you don't really want to step back across it. So that conversation had been had. And I'd like to think with some sensitivity, but nonetheless, there are some intense moments along the way.
Were there things that sort of you remembered from Oroville as a kid that as you did your interviews, you were like, wow, that my memory of that time is it must have been filtered through a child's brain, or
Yeah.
something that became you came to
Yeah.
rethink your childhood?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's really fascinating to revisit things you lived through as a child with the mind of an adult that's been out in the world and more honed, and to come back. So and to speak to people, like one of the beautiful aspects of writing this book is that because of this kind of professional mode, I would speak to people that I had very strong preconceived senses or notions about, often in a possibly negative, right? Because of certain things I had seen them do as adults, or certain ideas I had about them as adults. And to sort of like revisit that in a more dispassionate mode, and break down some of those barriers. And there were things that I was involved in. So one of the examples I discuss in the book is, Orville went through this very tumultuous period, and there was a group in the community that was ostracized somewhat unfairly, or quite unfairly in my view, and treated quite badly. And as often happens in these communities, kids are enlisted in this thing, or because the grown-ups around them say certain things, they just go along with it. And so there was this guy that, I mean, I was 11 years old, 12 years old, but me and my friends treated very badly. We like threw stones at him and name called him and stuff. And then I was interviewing him for the book because I wanted to get his perspective on this experience. And we go through this conversation an hour or two, and at the end of it, I say, I've walked around wanting to apologize to you for 20 years. And the guy's like, what? We're like, what happened? And I said, well, when I was 12 years old, I chased you down the street and I threw stones at you and I called you names. And he's like, I don't even remember that. Like, so many horrible things happened to me. But for me, I guess it was cathartic in a way. And like, now I see the guy and I feel at least that's been broken down between us. But it's pretty fascinating to sort of revisit moments like that as an adult and think about what we were caught up in and why we would do things like that, and what the forces were that were kind of driving us towards acting that way.
Yeah. And I imagine there is sort of a vacillation in your own opinion of things depending on who you interviewed last. I feel like that really comes out in your description of Satprem throughout the book, this central figure in leadership that
Yeah.
clearly is a mixed
Yeah.
figure.
Well, I try really hard. I try really hard when you're writing about faith. Like, I try really hard to accept people's interpretation of things, right? And there are things that people tell me about things they did or things that happened that seem like, magical realism to me. Like, I don't actually believe the world works that way. I don't believe that people like fly across the room and have superpowers. But I try to accommodate people's points of view. And so this comes out strongly with Satprem. And Satprem is one of the examples of where I got it. Like, that was, both sides. Like, you were too generous to him, you were much too kind to him. And frankly, I got some hate mail about the way I wrote about him. Um, what to do? I tried to tell the story often in other people's words and in his words. But he was a very complex figure who in some ways carries a lot of the complexity and ambivalence of that era in Orwell's history, and more generally of that line that I was talking about in Faith.
Yeah, maybe I invite you to say a little bit more for those who haven't read the book or don't know Orwell's history, because in many ways, I think he's sort of the embodiment of all those themes you struggle with in the text. Faith and science, leadership and boldness and idealism and realism. I mean, he just seems to embody all that. And so maybe I invite you to just share a little bit about him, because he's such a
Satprem, yeah.
interesting, yeah.
Yeah, he's a really complex, charismatic, powerful figure. And I think one of the key takeaways I took away from the book, and also others who read the book in Orwell said this to me, is just how determinative and key and central a role he played in Orwell's history. Like, I don't think I fully acknowledged that. Satprem was a French man whose original name was Bernard Engineer, who was he was a French resistance fighter. He had spent time in German concentration camps. And I don't think that's incidental to what happens later, because I think he was tortured. I think he was traumatized by that experience. He makes his way to Orville, where becomes one of her closest disciples, incredibly close to her. He's in the room with her in the final years. And she shares with him her theory of, cellular evolution, where she believes that she's transmuting the cells to achieve a kind of immortality. And he's writing this down, and he's interviewing this, and he's noting it all down. And eventually this gets published as the agenda of the mother, which some of you might know. But in order to publish that, he engages in a massive sort of power struggle with others who are close to the mother in the ashram. And essentially this gets caught. It's a complex story, but he becomes, through this power struggle, he becomes a key figure in Orwell's power struggle. There's a schism that breaks up in Orwell between the old guard, represented by the ashram, a more kind of Indian side of this community, and then the more sort of like hippie, Western, especially French Orwell. And Satprem, and those two, that world splits apart, right? And this is in my view, one of the great tragedies of Mother's World or of Orwell, that it splits. And Satprem plays a key role in that split, because he's a fiery French revolutionary who sort of like exhorts Orwellians on to revolution. Now, many Orwellians will tell you, no, this was a great thing because he gave us our freedom. And he saw that the old world was dragging us down and we had to break out to the future. And so that's the ambivalence that he carries with him. And, was he a freedom fighter who opened new possibilities to build a new world for Orwell? Or was he the one that kind of sundered Mother's World and created this schism that the community's never quite recovered from? And more generally for me, in this kind of revolutionary fervor, he incites a lot of the worst sort of aspects of fanaticism that I think the community eventually devolved into. There's some question about how directly responsible he was. Like, he wasn't the one out there saying, go and burn books, right? So, but the book burning happened, and it was tied to people who were close to him. So it's a complicated story. I will say I was grateful for the people who were close to Satprem, that they opened up to me and they told me their stories of being in his world, because it was a very cloistered world. And I think some of them may regret that. I think some of them are upset with me, and you know, I feel bad about that, but I'm still grateful that they gave me like stories so I better understood what happened there.
Yeah. I mean, having read it, I think you reveal all this complexity really well. Um, and um, you could imagine the temptation to throw some stones at various figures throughout it, but you make that complex. I'm going to
Yeah,
open up to questions and
just a quick thing, the aspect I didn't mention about Satprem, and this is the tie that ties all the strands of the book together, is he plays a key role in the deaths of John and Diane, right? So he ties the sort of more sociological strand, the personal strand. And when I realized that, I almost backed out of the project, because I wanted to write a book about my wife's family. I didn't want to write a book about Oroville and its you know, history and Satprem, and it felt like very sort of difficult terrain, but I couldn't avoid it. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll open up after this question. So if I invite people to raise their virtual hand or whatever, and we'll call upon you. But you know, one of the things in recent times, you've been teaching this course on utopia, and it's a different generation of people thinking about it. Just what have you learned from, you know, sort of this new generation thinking about utopia, and what do you hope that the students who take that class take away
Yeah.
from the class?
Yeah. I guess one thing I've learned that utopia is a very historically contingent notion. It's not a static concept. And, you know, for those of us who thought of utopia, I think we know this, that utopia is often a reaction to whatever's going on in society, right? There's this notion of utopia as critique. And so I and my generation, leaving aside the Orville experience, grew up in the shadow of sort of like the greatest failure of utopian thought in human history, probably the collapse of communism, the excesses of communism, the gulags, and you know, and fanaticism and fascism, which was a form of utopian thinking. And so I have a fairly skeptical take on utopianism, and I'm very, very attuned to the way it tips into fanaticism. The generation of kids I'm teaching now is growing up in, you know, in the shadow of like the 2008 crisis, the failures of incremental thinking, the sense that our system is at an impasse, the need for kind of radical reinvention, which I share, by the way. And so they're much more hopeful about utopian thinking and see it as much more necessary. And so they're much more optimistic about utopianism than I am. One of the kids in my class said in a kind of kind way, he said, I feel really catfished by this class. Like, I thought I was joining a class about utopian thinking, and you're sitting around putting down utopian thinking, you know? And then I engaged him in this conversation. I was like, well, I have a different view of it because I grew up in a different generation. So I think that is a very strong sense I've taken away, that utopian thinking means different things and has different values at different moments in history.
Yes. Yeah, well, Deborah, why don't you start us off here with your question? I invite you to unmute.
Sure. Yeah, Akash, I really deeply appreciated in your book the authentic way that you wrestled with the light and dark sides of utopian experimentation. For example, you seem on the one hand to really admire the colorful self-starters who devote their lives to trying to build a new society. But then on the other hand, you seem to be filled with horror at the way that lives were sacrificed in the quest for utopia. So I'm curious how you've come to terms with what seem to be competing feelings.
Yeah. I don't know that I've come to terms with it per se, and certainly with some of the excesses that were committed. I think it's just really important to hold those dual perspectives in one's mind, right? And I think utopianism, which is a form of faith, and like faith itself, is a very complex notion, as human beings are. And I think we do a disservice to it to either dismiss it as just like, well, utopian thinking that has no point and no purpose in the world, but it's also incumbent upon us to recognize that it can tip over, and has historically often tipped over into very dark places and done some bad things, right? I mean, look at it throughout history. Like, look at the French Revolution, great enlightened movement for individual liberty, or the guillotine, right? Like both. And I think we just need to be aware. We need to be aware of that at a sociological level, but also at a personal level, because after all, it's individuals that are committing these actions. And you know, within myself, I would like to not sort of like go either way. I guess I'm a centrist or an incrementalist or whatever, but I want to hold on to the possibilities of radical social transformation, but I also want to recognize how dangerous that can be.
Yeah, Cheryl, I invite you to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks, Stephen. I was thinking about what you were saying about there being a revival movement and it kind of falling into fanaticism and their response to that. I was wondering if that led to changes in a succession plan for leadership, or how power was shared, or the decision-making process.
You mean what's going on now, or do you mean historically, or?
Well, you had talked about there being a revival movement and then a response to that. And I was wondering during that process whether that changed the way power was shared and decision-making was handled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Both the two times I've seen this happen were like in the late 70s, early 80s, and then now. And you know, it's hard to know. These are ideological movements, but as ideological movements often are, they're also just kind of interpersonal and interfactional struggles for power, right? And I think these two things are often intertwined, which is to say that the people struggling, trying to reclaim power, also firmly believe in the ideological component of their struggle for power. So certainly that has happened historically, and it's happening now. And there are these you know, there's shifts in power within the community, which are often mapped onto visions of purity, visions of how pure Oroville is, and how much are people committed to the true cause, and sometimes manipulations of these concepts, right? I mean, we know this happens with religion all the time, like, you know, calls for purity or manipulations of whatever, of doctrinal teachings, of scriptures. And so there's certainly a lot of throwing around of quotations by the mother, by both sides in these power struggles, which I do believe that both sides honestly believe what they're saying, but they're also underlying these are struggles for power. And this is happening. Yeah, this is happening in Oroville right now. I mean, there've been articles about it in the New York Times and the Guardian. It's an ongoing kind of fire that's burning through the community right now.
Okay, thanks.
Christopher, I invite you to unmute and ask a question.
I'm not hearing.
Yeah, but Christopher, we're not quite getting you here.
Christopher, you could write your question in the chat, since we're not hearing you. If you want to do that, we could do it that way.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, while we wait for Christopher, it looks like he's on a walk with blue sky behind to speak. I'm curious, Akash, that you have this deep history with Oroville. Have you and your family been tempted to explore other communities, or is it something that it's Oroville, you know, so embedded in your life that this is the path for you?
No, I'm very interested in this. I'm very interested in the possibilities of alternative living and alternative thinking. I, for better or for worse, don't fit comfortably within the mainstream world, and so, you know, I'm very interested in it. I'm also like somewhat wary of it, because I feel the process of living in these communities and going through all these kinds of factional struggles and it's exhausting, and it's disappointing often. And so I'm wary of that. And you know how these worlds are. Like, on the one hand, there are these incredible noble experiments, and on the other hand, they're little bickering little villages, right? And that aspect of them is also exhausting. But generally, no, I'm very interested, and I would like to know more about what's going on. And as I said, these things are historically contingent. So I believe that there may be communities in the world that are exploring new aspects of communal living and utopian thinking that may be more kind of like in tune with the times or whatever.
Cheryl, go ahead.
I recognize this as kind of asking you to look in your crystal ball a bit and make a prediction, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how you think the ongoing development and the increased interaction with outsiders is going to affect the faith at Oroville and their practices.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing, and it's complicated. I think on the one hand, it's a good thing because I think that the community has been very insular, and as these communities often are. And so I think the injection of new perspectives and new energy is very healthy, right? So I think that's a good thing. I think that there's a question of like, how does a place remain true to itself? How does a society remain true to itself when you have new people coming in, new forces coming in, particularly in a place like there's not that much institutional history in Oroville. There's no, very firmly established governance structures. There's no constitution per se. And one of the things I was doing in this book in a way was trying to write a history of the place to like sort of create some, so we know how we got to where we are today. So I think the people who come in see it for what it is today and may devalue, some of the contributions of what happened earlier. Let me to make this more concrete. There is a struggle in the community now over what it should look like physically, because there is a sort of city plan for Oroville that has not fully manifested. And what's happened instead is this amazing forest has come up and there's been this amazing green work. And I think for a lot of people coming in now, they say, well, these trees are in the way, right? Like this is supposed to be a city. And there isn't sufficient recognition of the amazing energy and idealism that went into transforming this desert into this forest. So it's difficult.
If I could just put in a quick follow-up question is, how is technology affecting Oroville? Like, is the internet and is that a big factor there in how people are learning about the outside world?
Yes, totally. When I was growing up, it was closed, it was isolated, you had very little information. Now you're obviously much more plugged in, like everywhere in the world, for better or for worse. During COVID, there was tons of misinformation, and also, memes, like global memes travel down to Oroville, QAnon, things like that, sprouting in Oroville. Like, so absolutely, it's changed that dynamic.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Christopher had a chance to type his message, and I'll read it for you here. Perspective, I'm curious to hear about it, how it aligns with your observations in the past and present conflicts. We have a hypothesis that under ideology, there are aspects of human nature. Drives for purity and doctrine, even from the leftist ideology, would be hypothesized as a righteous nature. And so I think what he's really asking here is, there's a lot of stuff that is coming up with presumptions about what we are as humans, and then mapping it on to some inherent nature. And I'm wondering, I think he's wondering what you're thinking about that.
Yeah. My view is that human nature, as you call it, which is a controversial sort of notion, right? Like the idea of like a fixed human nature. But I think that human nature plays a huge role in a lot of what goes on in these communities. And part of the struggle of utopian communities across time is this attempt to sort of reinvent what a human is, right? Take us away from our base kind of gene propagating, essentially selfish, accumulative natures. And so I think you're constantly running up against that, often in the name of ideology. One of the wisest things or most telling things that somebody once said to me in Oroville, and it didn't make it into the book, but he told me, he said he was an early pioneer there, and he said, everything was going fine in Oroville. Everything was working out until people started having kids. And we're all able to like sacrifice things for ourselves and live for the community when it's just us. But the minute we start having kids, like our sort of essential human gene sort of protective nature kicks in, and we start like becoming more selfish and wanting, to be more individualized. So I think it's a big thing. Yes.
Yeah, I think the follow-up is on that too. So on that front, I think one of the interesting parts about Aurobindo, sort of the original inspiration for this was this sort of blending of science and philosophy in the West and traditional Indian thought. And I think as we've talked about with a lot of the environmental work at Oroville, it's been inspired by some great science, but then also this sort of blending with Ayurvedic or some traditional Indian thought. So I'm curious about like what that role of science has played in Oroville as that evolved, and then how you think through sort of the scientific mindset versus the idealist mindset or the faith-based mindset.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right that Sri Aurobindo was an attempt to integrate different forms of knowledge, right? So I guess, I mean, to some extent, I would question the paradigm of like science versus non-science, because I mean, I think a lot of people in Oroville would think of Ayurvedic knowledge or traditional knowledge as a form of science, right? Recognizing what you mean is like Western science here. But so I think that in some ways, Oroville is this attempt to integrate different forms of knowledge and fuse the West and East in a very interesting way that many traditional ashrams in India are not, right? And I think this was Sri Aurobindo sort of like one of his great contributions to Indian sort of philosophy and thought was a recognition that there were things that had to be brought in and a kind of revitalization of Hinduism rather than just a return to some kind of ancient knowledge. And that is an ongoing effort in Oroville that, again, I think has oscillated between, John and Diane die because they reject Western medicine, to put it bluntly. And I understand where it's coming from. I recognize where that impulse is coming from. I think they went too far. Right. This played out during COVID in struggles in the community over vaccination, as it did in much of the world, over the nature of COVID. So this sort of like, how does the rational mind fit in with the, what do you want to call it, the instinctive mind or the sort of spiritual being, is not something that the community has resolved. And every now and then you get these tragedies where people tip over the edge because they believe too much in one or the other.
Deborah.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, I desperately wanted Diane to accept her disability and get a wheelchair and just move out into the world. And it was so hard to watch her not do that. And do you think that the primary reason that she didn't was because to do so would mean to give up her faith, or are there other things going on there?
Yeah, I don't know if it would mean giving up her faith. I think that somebody in the book, as you know, did like fused faith onto the struggle for her. And the way I look at it is that she was in a very vulnerable position after her accident, casting about for meaning. Why did this happen? And somebody came along and gave her meaning. Right, and gave her a kind of, as somebody I interviewed said, something to sort of cling to in the storm. And I think that in the early years, it sort of helped her with the why me and sort of gave her meaning and possibly even rescued her from depression because it gave her a purpose. But then clearly it just went too far. And yes, we all, I mean, most people who read the book and knew Diane wished that she had accepted it at some point.
Well, we try to keep these to around an hour. We started a few minutes late, but I think maybe if there's no questions, I'll ask a final question for you. And this involves your kids. They're third generation Orovillians. Is that the proper term? And do you hope they come back to live there as adults, or do you think they will? Where does this multi-generation journey end?
I don't have strong feelings about whether they end up living in Oroville or not. I guess what I would like is for them to go through life knowing that there are other ways of living, right? That you don't, I now they're a little older, so they would just laugh at me. But when they were young, I would point out advertising billboards to them and say, lies, propaganda, and you can choose to subscribe to it, but I want you to know. I want you to know, and I want you to be aware of it. And then if you choose to like buy into it and live by those rules, that's fine. But I just want them to be aware And I'm really grateful to Orville because I think it's given them that. It's given them a wider kind of perspective on life and what matters in life, and that there are many different ways of living life, and there are many different ways of finding meaning in life. And then it's up to them what they do.
Well, I want to close by thanking you, Akash, for taking time out of your day to share your book, to encourage everybody to read Better to Have Gone if you have not got a copy yet or listened to it. And just to say that, it is one of those wonderful stories of idealism. And whether its future is bounteous or destructive, we will see, but that there's a certain value just to having those ideals and to have a place in the world that's trying to do something different. And I'm very appreciative of your work, Akash, in recording those for a memorial. So thank you for your book. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you so much for everybody who joined us live here or are listening to this in a recording.
I just want to say one thing in closing, which I've been wondering whether to say or not, but it's actually quite a moving talk for me because one of the key figures in the book, Gillian Walker, John Walker's sister, passed away day before yesterday. And I'm sitting in her place in New York thinking about her and having this conversation. So I guess I just want to kind of memorialize her and say that at the end of this conversation.
Yes. And she's present in these talks in some form or another. So we appreciate that time. And there will be a closing discussion. I think it's in about 25 minutes in one of the other rooms. But we will close today's session with that and with much appreciation. Thank you, Akash.
Bye. Thank you all.